Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to fact check RFK Jr. He made an appearance on one of my favorite podcasts, All In. This is a podcast run by 4 technology people who are all multimillionaires or billionaires, and they have a good discussion each week. I actually enjoy listening to it. They have different points of view, different political points of view. They let people flesh it out. On this week's episode, they bring in RFK Jr. He's running for president, and they give him 2 hours to make his views known on a variety of issues. And because of that it's an unedited interview with RFK Jr., I have the opportunity to go through the claims he made, say what he got right, what he got wrong, what he was unclear about, and I'm going to do a breakdown of that in this video. Now, I commend them for this format. It's in opposition to the historical way in which we vetted political candidates by writing pieces about them. That's the way the New York Times likes to do it. I will draw a contrast between this podcast and the Sunday article that appeared on Elizabeth Holmes in the New York Times. This article, a reporter goes to meet Elizabeth Holmes and is captivated by her relatively normal life and seems to like her and writes this fluff piece. And in the piece, I never see her ask the question I want to ask Elizabeth Holmes, which is, you gave false results to real people and you knew you were giving false results. Do you have any remorse for that? How do you feel about that? That's the question I want to see. That question wasn't in that fluff piece. And in fact, most of the piece was the author's opinion of Elizabeth Holmes, not actually what she's saying or doing. In contrast, All In lets the listener, the audience, decide. Did RFK Jr. make a point? It gives all the information to the audience, and I think that's the way we got to go forward in society. John Mindrell and I talk about that in this week's Sensible Medicine, how long-form interviews are the future. Having said that, because I have this opportunity, I can fact-check RFK Jr. and go through what he said right, wrong. Let's do it. Lockdowns. RFK Jr. was strongly opposed to lockdowns. He states, quote, "Instead of a public health response to a public health crisis, we had a militarized and monetized response, which is the inverse response to what you would want to a public health crisis." And forgive me if that quote's a little bit off, but that's roughly what he said. I tried to transcribe as best I could. RFK Jr. added that lockdown was not in the pre-pandemic playbook. Nobody thought it was a good idea. They thought the harms would far exceed the benefits, and it was generally thought to be avoided at all costs. What are my thoughts on this? Well, I think RFK Jr. actually has a point. He is correct that it was not part of pre-pandemic guidance. In fact, Bush administration commissioned many such documents about pandemic guidance, and it specifically said you don't want to lock down, you certainly don't want to close schools in all but the absolute worst situation, a situation we weren't even close to. You don't want to do that because the harms of these strategies are going to far outweigh the benefits. And I think he also has a point that it wasn't a public health response when you start to use the police state. Public health has always been about giving resources to people so that they can improve their own outcomes going forward. It's not to use the power of military force against the populace. I actually think RFK Jr. could strengthen his argument a little bit. He could ask the audience who benefited from the lockdowns. And the answer is, of course, the major technology companies. They get you to stay at home, so you turn your attention to their product. Netflix, Amazon, YouTube, this platform. These are the companies that benefit from it. And so naturally, they would be happy to censor anyone who opposed those policies. They were happy to toe the line. Who was hurt by the policies was the mom and pop stores, the people who were just running regular businesses, restaurants, shops, regular people. They were hurt. And who did the bailout money go to? And also went to the rich. So RFK Jr. has a broader sort of argument that he makes in this podcast, which is that too much of the system is rigged in favor of the elites and hurts the middle-class working person. And I think this is a nice example of that. So on lockdowns, I will also add that the jury is still out to some degree as to whether or not lockdowns helped, and if so, under what circumstances. I would think that the final verdict will begin in the next decade or so. Very likely, there may be very specific situations in which people think some measures of lockdown had some benefit, but the vast majority of it is going to be thought of very poorly, unlikely to have made a major difference in outcomes beyond voluntary behavioral change, and very likely has a whole host of secondary and tertiary externalities, particularly school closure, which was the most devastating and boneheaded policy decision never made. I think in the last 20 years of domestic policy, the dumbest decision. Number 2, stupid COVID policy. RFK Jr. makes one point, quote, "Police were pulling surfers out of the ocean and ticketing them," end quote. He makes a good point here. In fact, I put a link in my Substack post to an article where it says UC San Diego virus expert pleads with surfers to stay out of the ocean to avoid coronavirus. Public health did a lot of stupid things. They took the rims off basketball hoops. They closed playgrounds. They discouraged people from meeting outside. In Australia, as Zeb Yamrozic points out, they actually prevented you from going on walks with friends. And they pulled surfers out of the ocean. Now we know, of course, only an idiot would think that the virus was spread in the ocean. It isn't. And actually, we didn't know that at the time. We actually knew outdoor spread was infinitely rare and had seldom been reported, and yet we didn't embrace that. We combined the police state with the visible, the public commons, and we combined that in a very inappropriate way. So I think RFK Jr. is correct there. That's a misuse of public power, and that is concerning and fits with his argument about lockdowns, early treatment. RFK Jr. is a big proponent of hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, and on that issue, I think he's completely wrong. He's completely wrong because the way you validate hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin is the exact same way you validate masks, which is you conduct randomized control trials and look at the pooled point estimate. And in my Substack, I make available two of the largest meta-analyses on these topics. One on hydroxychloroquine, which just shows a stone-cold negative point estimate and confidence interval. One on ivermectin, which shows the same, a stone-cold negative point estimate and confidence interval. This is a pooled analysis of all the randomized control trials. And ironically, it's the same as the Tom Jefferson review on Cochrane and masking. So I'm the consistent party here. I'm going to judge toddler masking, adult masking, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, dexamethasone, all the same, which is in pooled or randomized control trials. Do you improve outcomes? And the answer is masking, no. Hydroxychloroquine, no. Ivermectin, no. Dexamethasone, yes. And actually in people who are mechanically ventilated on oxygen. That's where it works. RFK Jr. doesn't talk about the pooled analysis of randomized trials. He argues in favor of these products by saying, one, that African nations that people take hydroxychloroquine or take ivermectin, they had better outcomes. But this is really a bit of a stretch. This is very poor ecological data. I mean, we're comparing one nation to another nation. First thing I think you should know, and you all know, is that you do know these nations are not counting deaths the same. And that's a point that the podcast hosts make. You can't really compare Nigeria to the United States. They're not counting deaths the same in Nigeria, okay? We may be overcounting and they're likely undercounting. That's probably the way it is. All of the nations around the world did not count deaths the same. So it's very hard to make country-to-country comparisons. Moreover, there are lots of moving parts. It's not just that they take some hydroxychloroquine derivatives in other countries. They also have different age structure. They have different resources. They have different hospital capacity. They had different patterns of spread and social networks. And all of these things do matter. So I think you cannot justify a drug based on country-to-country comparison. What you need to do is pooled or randomized control trials. They've done many, and they are stone-cold negative. So on early treatment, he's wrong. One of the arguments he makes is that if there's any drug that's effective, then they wouldn't have had EUA authority to approve the COVID-19 vaccine. And ergo, that's why they didn't want to declare these two drugs effective. The problem I have with that is that, but the summer of 2020, we did know steroids were effective in this slice of severe COVID-19 from the recovery study, and yet they still had the EUA. So I'm not entirely sold. Is this even true that a drug precludes an EUA? Because it certainly didn't. We had an effective drug. Didn't preclude EUA. The final thing is he's critical of remdesivir. I think that's accurate. I have it in my post. The pooled meta-analysis of randomized trials of remdesivir is also negative. Let's turn to regulatory capture. RFK Jr. is worried that our regulatory agencies do the work of the industry that they're supposed to regulate. And on this issue, I think he actually has a pretty good point. That the FDA reviewers, their primary place they go to work after the FDA is, in fact, the pharmaceutical industry. Rochelle Walensky just stepped down from CDC. We'll see where she goes. Scott Gottlieb used to be FDA commissioner. Now he's on the board of directors of Pfizer, and he's also talking about how important Pfizer products are. Why is this a problem? When you're in government and you rubber stamp a perpetual booster campaign in men who are 20 years old who've had COVID, that's a dubious decision. It's very likely they're going to have myocarditis. The upside of that additional dose, now that they've had COVID and they've had a few doses, that's going to be small. In fact, it's poorly quantified because we actually don't have good randomized control trials in that population. And so the person making that decision is somebody who is shaping their views based on lower quality evidence. That person later goes to work for the company that profited handsomely from that decision. It looks like corruption, and it looks very bad. I think RFK Jr. has a point there. That is, in fact, a sign or symptom of regulatory capture, and people working there know that that's where you're going to go to work later, and so while they're working there, they may have different behavior. They may not be a tough regulator. That's something I've been worried about for many years. I linked to a BMJ article we wrote on the topic in 2016. Vaccines, RFK Jr. talks very broadly about all vaccines. His arguments were rather unpersuasive to me. His two major arguments were, one, that they don't need to do placebo-controlled trials The point is taken that the control arm is often some other vaccine or some adjuvant. It's not just a saltwater injection, but that's not going to affect too many things. It's certainly not going to affect your ability to detect a rare safety signal, because that's going to be affected no matter what the control arm is, placebo or a totally inert placebo or whatever they're doing. It's not going to affect the ability to see an efficacy signal on a particular viral endpoint. So I found that to be lacking. The second thing he says is he paints rather broadly that we've seen a rise in chronic disease, neurologic disease, and autoimmunity since 1989. Few things are different in that time span. Maybe cell phones took off, maybe vaccines took off, and so vaccines have to be high on your list of things to suspect. He didn't unpack the argument much further than that, but obviously that argument would be entirely and woefully lacking because, the Berlin Wall also fell right around that time. So that's what caused the uptick in these diseases. Moreover, it's not clear to me what diseases he's even talking about. These are very broad terms. This is not a rigorous causal analysis. And so I think that overall, that was a very unpersuasive section of the interview, that to paint with a broad brush that all vaccines are bad. I think he didn't make that case, not even close. I think he really needs to focus on the very specific case that is indisputable, which is that this administration continued to encourage multiple doses of vaccine in young men who had already had COVID-19. In fact, in some places, their edicts led to booster mandates for those men. Some of those men may have had myocarditis. That's a population that's clearly had a net harm signal, and that's a place that you can really put your finger on as a misuse of government power, an abuse of government power. And I think he would have a much stronger argument if he focused there and sort of stopped painting with such a broad brush. Direct-to-consumer advertising. It turns out there's only 2 countries in the world where you can have pharmaceutical firms directly advertising to people. Those are the United States and New Zealand. And it is pretty stupid, actually. It's pretty stupid. There are a number of studies that show that by doing that, they're more likely to get the patient to ask the doctor about the specific product, and they're more likely to get that specific product. These are studies that are well done over many years. I think we detailed that in my first book, Ending Medical Reversal. I cite a more recent paper by Kesselheim and Avorn from Harvard. I think he's right to be suspicious of the fact that pharma has such a tremendous ability to advertise products that you can't just go out and buy. In fact, I think one thing is illustrative of this fact. I was watching TV and there was an ad that said, ask your doctor if you have non-squamous, non-small cell lung cancer, because this drug may be right for you. And I thought to myself, there's one thing you know about that drug. If you can advertise to people with non-squamous, non-small cell lung cancer on national television, which is that for every 100,000 people you're advertising to, you're probably only reaching 1 or 2 people who could even be eligible for this product. And that means for that ad campaign to be worth it, that drug's got to be hella expensive. And it is hella expensive. It's hella expensive. And that's what justifies that. And that expense is also unfounded. Media and censorship. RFK Jr. alludes to the censorious media. He talks about a recent ABC interview where they cut out everything he said. The hosts were really on his side on this issue, that this is unacceptable. It is unacceptable. If you don't want to interview him, you don't have to interview him. If you interview him, let's play the interview unedited. Let the audience decide. How can what he says be so objectionable? I listened to what he said about vaccines. I found it unpersuasive. I'm telling you why it's unpersuasive, because he's just making a broad causal leap. Around 1989, he's also talking about the placebo control, but he's not taking me all the steps through his reasoning, and he's casting aspersions on everything, and that's unpersuasive. Let him play the interview. Play the interview out. Let people decide what they think. We don't need to infantilize the American people. That's disgusting. And the media, to the prior point about conflict, RFK Jr. argues that the media has so much advertisements from the pharmaceutical firms. Of course, they don't want anybody having any message that is critical of who feeds them, which is the pharma firms. And that's a problem. I mean, that is the appearance of conflict of interest. But the beauty is that there's a podcast called All In that doesn't have this problem, and they're able to deliver the message straight to whoever wants to listen. So in conclusion, I think we need more of this sort of stuff. People who are the boogeyman, people who are criticized, people who are part of the national dialogue should be brought into these conversations, allowed to say all their views. You can say what they got right, what they got wrong. Lockdowns, I think he has a point. Vaccines, I don't think so. Focusing on the COVID-19 failures, I think he has a point. And censorship, I think he's got a really good point. Overall, I think he's already got 20% of the polls. Let's see if that stays. But He's clearly shown that he is a player in this presidential race, and media would be foolish to dismiss him. He's got the Kennedy branding. He's got a number of issues where I think he's going to be able to connect with the electorate. And finally, I think all in, they're good to do this. It's the exact thing you want to do. New York Times, they're doing fluff pieces from 1985, okay? Join the Times. Put out unedited interviews with people. Ask them about all the topics. Ask the hard questions. If you get Fauci, ask him just one question. Dr. Fauci, you control the NIAID budget. That means you're in charge of research funding for infectious disease. During this pandemic, there were many NPIs. There were many rules for non-pharmacologic interventions like distancing, cohorting. Why didn't you run any randomized trials of that? That's the question I want to see someone ask. Then he'll say, okay, well, we knew masks work. Okay, Dr. Fauci, just for the sake of argument, let's say that's true. It's not, of course. I read Cochrane. It's not. But let's say it's true. If it's true, why didn't you do a randomized trial of an N95 versus a KF94, Dr. Fauci? Because we don't know which one of those is better. So no matter where he says what we know or don't know, there's still a trial he could have done. He didn't do it. And that's the real question. Why do you go on TV all day and you don't generate any evidence? Why do you consider that to be a scientist? And I don't think so. So Rochelle Lewinsky resigned on Friday. I'm going to be back with a video on that. 4 reasons why she's not a scientist. She's 0 for 4 on my science count. But I thought I'd do this one first because the All In podcast is really capturing a lot of attention out there. And in part because I think they gave a man 2 hours. And the final thing I say is the bulk of the conversation is not even about COVID-19 or health. The bulk of the conversation was about energy, foreign policy, was about a little bit of the culture wars. It was about all the other issues that go into being a presidential candidate. I'm not going to fact check those because it's not my expertise. My expertise is this. And I call it like I see it. I heard somebody say that you praised him, you criticized him. I've heard that it was a critical piece, it was a praise piece. I'm just calling balls and strikes here, people. You disagree? Well, if you disagree, here's why you might disagree. You might like his views on some of these issues, and here's why you'd be wrong. I have a core philosophical point of view, which is that when you do things on people, you're much more likely to get it wrong than right. When you offer a new pill, or you tell them to wear a cloth over their mouth, it's much more likely not to do something than it is to do something because people always make up all sorts of health interventions and most don't work. The only way you can separate whether or not it actually does something from your faith and mysticism and love of pathophysiology is to do a randomized control trial. On all these issues, they have done many. And when they do them, they do give a reliable answer. The first 2 doses of the COVID-19 vaccine had a huge reduction in COVID-19 infection and severe disease in the Moderna's randomized control trial. But boosters in young men were never subjected to the same sort of rigorous appraisal. Hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, masks. We can look at the randomized data for this. I have a simple view. Randomized trials are the solution for these kinds of scientific queries. That's the right answer. That's the answer that everyone will eventually come to when they relax a little bit. I know they're fighting it, and I apply that equally to all points of view. There are people who think that these lower quality forms of evidence matter. They don't study medicine. They study, all sorts of other sciences where that might play a role, but not in medicine, where we have different standards for different reasons, because the human body is marvelously complex and behavior is very difficult to master and predict. So, if you like this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment, leave a message below. I'll be back for Rochelle Walensky's quitting or firing, whatever happened. I'll be back to do that. She's leaving the CDC. They dropped it on a Friday because they didn't want the news cycle to pick it up. So I'll be back. I won't forget. Until next time.